But Steepa was no fool, and knew she was feigning, which indeed Osrith had been, for when he made to put an arm down to his defeated enemy, Osrith drew out Buey, raking her across the man's stomach, goring a line across his weathered leather. He pushed her down, and stepped back, as Osrith panted. She could have gone on, would have gone on if this were a battle, and it was only Steepa's retreating feet that caused her to climb back to her own feet. Though the decision was knife-edge, Osrith could easily have feigned concession, then leapt on his legs again. Ultimately, though, Osrith knew it, Steepa knew it, that she had almost beaten him, and she stood boldly, so he realized that she had indeed stopped in her demonstrative attack. "SN, good," Steepa snorted, as Osrith strode over to Elfrith. "You, there, boys." Steepa pointed across to them. What did that warrior do well? Didn't give up, kept going. Hayard bubbled in. His face had been the most animated in the battle. Osrith knew. He was keen to learn, but he needed to listen, or he would end up being keen to die. Yes, Steepa agreed. Anything else? Charged at you, went for where you were vulnerable, Godwin put in. Yes. He also pretended to be defeated. The Danes know this as well, but in battle, it is hard to judge the pretenders. And there was that unholy screaming. This exclamation came from behind the group. Steepa looked over the heads of the warriors, easy when he was so tall, and dipped his head. "My lady," he acknowledged. They turned. This was the first time Osrith would remember, in the years to come, that she had seen Ethelfled. She stood tall, and was only around a year younger than herself, Osrith knew. And beside her stood her father. King Alfred watched them, catching Osrith's eye for a moment before Osrith looked away. The king and his daughter had watched her fight. "Could you explain to the warriors how this helps, my lady?" It was a lot of deferential words in one sentence, Osrith realized, and as she looked in their direction again, she noticed her father nod his head briefly. "Your man here," Ethelfled continued, catching Osrith's look with her own gaze, poised, practiced speaker that she was, and battle-wise. It was clear Ethelfled took an interest in warfare. That scream, it sent a chill down my spine. The chanting beforehand, a recitation. Osrith realized that Ethelfled was addressing her. "No, my lady, my saint, my king, my kin." "Your king?" Osrith could feel the color drain from her face, as she watched Ethelfled glance over at her father. Clearly any king to be mentioned in Winchester was Alfred, the only king that mattered. "Flansinner, High King of Irian," Osrith lied. "It was as good a king as any." "Erland," she clarified. "And your people make that ... yelling?" This time Osrith said nothing. Why was this unusual? It was what the Dol Riotans, the people of Alba, did in battle. She had always done it. The Uineals did it. Even the Danes did it. Did not the West Saxons embolden themselves with a battle cry? "It was how I was trained, my lady," Osrith said, simply. "And it was used to good effect." This time, the king spoke. Osrith looked across to Alfred, then bowed her head. Steepa was startled, just for a moment. This time, she realized, the king was addressing all of the warriors. "Just for a moment," Alfred clarified, looking at Steepa, for Steepa has been a fighter for many years. Less experienced or prepared enemy would be fleeing the field, or at least be making fatal mistakes. And that's sometimes all you need, a loose stitch in a garment to make the whole of the enemy's army unravel. "Do go on," Alfred added. The training continued, under the watchful eye of the King of Wessex and his daughter. Osrith was paired with Elfgar, and Steepa with Elfrith, to demonstrate the basic sword skills that they needed to master, until the king left, followed by Ethelfled and, Osrith noticed, a young boy, presumably the king's son, who had been shown the warriors in order to begin his warrior preparation. It was a good few hours, until just after the highest point of the sun, when Steepa called a halt. He had been called to the king, and the warriors had been told to go to the kitchens. Lord Odda's men, one of the pages called through, and they were given meat and ale. They would practice that afternoon too, and the days when Odda and the king were there at Winchester. Something caught her eye as she followed Elfgar across the palace grounds, where she had been fighting Steepa. A jewel was in the dirt. It was the pearlized metal pin that she wore in her hair, given to her what seemed like a lifetime ago, but in fact, had been only a few months ago, by the Norseman Erik Thorgilson. Osrith stooped down for it, only to find her hand crushed by the boot of someone. Miral. He was back, then, from his excursion with the king. Do not repeat that display of savagery again, Gaelish scum. Miral spat the words at her as Osrith tried to move her hand, but his boot was crushing her bones. He bent to say more, but did not reckon on Osrith pulling out seeks with her left hand and thrusting it in the direction of his groin. Then, she shouldered at his legs, unsteadying Miral enough for him to move. Gaelish savage. He growled in her direction, but did not attack her back. You have brought yourself to the attention of King Alfred, he glowered, before stalking off towards the ramparts. Oh, she could follow him, Osrith thought, as pride glowed in her stomach at her vindication of her skill in the face of Miral's insults at her underdeveloped stature. Instead of following, to voice her gloating, Osrith grabbed at the pearl, and a handful of dirt with it, and followed the other warriors to the kitchens. 88,888,888. I tell you, the Lady Ethelfled is to be betrothed tomorrow, Godwin insisted as Hayard looked through the kitchens, where the warriors stood, eating the offcuts of sheep meat and bread. Osrith looked past the kitchen's door and out into the courtyard, where the royal family had stood not an hour before. Tell him, Elfrith, Godwin finished, as Hayard continued to grin, stupidly. You can lust after her, all warriors lust after pretty women, but yes, the Mersons will be arriving shortly and their shit of a Lord Ethelred is going to be betrothed to her, then we'll wed her, and she will leave to the Merson lands. Those not overrun by the Danes, in any case. Elfgar shifted, and drained more ale. Miral will want to return to Mercia, if he can. Then I want to go, too, Hayard declared, and see the fragrant lady of the Mersons ever daily. You are a bard, Hayard, Godwin accused. Are you sure you are not a Briton? What did happen to Miral? Osrith drifted closer and asked the question of Elfgar, who had himself come from the Merson Guard. Unpaid Virgil. He had a choice, loss of lands, or exile. Lord Odo intervened and is now the landlord, and Miral works in his service. Osrith said no more, thinking how the loss of land or the indentured service to a lord changed a man. And you, Osrith? Drawing the attention of a king? Elfrith tried to imitate her accent. My saint, my lord, my king. Who was your king? Elfgar asked. Erland, Osrith said. The High King of Erland. And you serve him no longer? Osrith looked away, feigning shame. Like Miral, I fell into disfavor, and as such, I have been passed from lord to lord, until I nearly fell into the hands of the Danes. I seek my kin, here, she added, hating herself for the attention she had drawn to herself. Because now, anyone Irish might be seen as her kin. Lord Odo may make inquiries into her time before. And now she had angered Miral by fighting so well, he may make her life very difficult. Then, Osrith relaxed. It is the way, is it not? That warriors are merely better-class slaves. Lord Utad may agree with you, Elfgar. The older novice nodded. Osrith felt her heart hammer in her chest. As coolly as she could, they looked over to him. Who? A pagan. The pagan who was married to the Lady Mildrith. A pagan lord. Married to Mildrith. Elfrith had mentioned a pagan husband, and a pagan queen from Cornwall. That had been her brother. He is in the service of Alfred. His lands, supposedly, up in the north, which he is desperate to reclaim, was on a mission for the king, when he fell into dispute with a Danish king. A Danish king? Hayard asked, looking over to the older warrior. No, I mean a king, in the north of Britain, who has been made so, and was Danish. Alfred approved it. And he sent him tribute, to keep him in his place. Guthard, Osrith whispered, thoughts invading her mind. What? Elfgar looked across to her. Nothing, Osrith said. This Utad, why has he displeased the king? So, not displeased him, Elfgar replied, as the doors of the kitchens were opened from the courtyard so a dead pig could be brought through for cooking. He lowered his voice. Yet, he will not renounce his paganism. Ended up as a slave to Danes, so I hear. Then they liked him and brought him up as their own. He looked around at the warriors who were listening, food and ale suspended as they listened. He can speak like one of them and worships their gods, even though he was baptized twice, Osrith added, silently. So, Hiofka added, relishing the story, ends up down here, fights for the king, marries the Lady Mildrith, leaves her, and travels north on Alfred's behalf to ensure fellowship. So Alfred can show who's Bretwalda. Alfred scoffed. He has ambition for there to be only one king in the whole of the British Isles. Ireland too? Osrith asked. Why not? Alfka scoffed. But the bastard Danes, and the Norse are keeping him from conquering the traditional kingdoms. Danelaw has helped. Mercia are none too happy, I can tell you. Miral is resentful. Why? Asked Godwin, biting into his bread. Because his lands are now in Daneland, of course. East Anglia. Oh, the king is called Ethelstan, Guthard. I am sure you have heard of him. Indeed, thought Osrith. The Battle of Ethan done. Oblivion to all of the English and Saxon kingdoms if Alfred had lost. And even if they weren't, Miral owes his living to the Lord Odda, for the debt. And you seem to have upset him, Osrith, Elfgar added, by fighting like a bloody berserker. Osrith said nothing, but nodded, modestly. So, why would this pagan lord feel he is enslaved? Pressed Godwin. Because he was one, of course. This northern, Danish king sold him into slavery for, well, I dunno. Something about a woman. His sister, I think. Elfgar turned to Hayard. So, keep your eyes, and your mind off the Lady Ethelfled, will you? If you want to just be a mere warrior servant. And God knows we need as many men as we can for the next battle. Whenever, but why? A voice penetrated the kitchens, breaking Elfgar's conversation, as two women followed the first as she went with speed about the courtyard. You made the arrangements, did you not? The Lady Elswith, Elfgar nodded, sheepishly as he grinned into his tankard. Now there's a mercen noblewoman for you, and I thought you said to keep our minds and eyes off. Elfrith chided as the assembled warriors cheered in approval of the warriors' pursuits of the noble female variety. This is why I am in the service of the Lord Odda, Elfgar conceded. Why do you think I am a mere novice? At the age of 26, men 10 years younger than me have been generals. No, he added, I was a slave at Aylesbury, Mercia's capital. Unlike Miral, I no land to lose when I fell into disfavor, he added, so but I was passed from Sjöulf's household. Her uncle Elfgar looked abashed. I spoke to her more often than the Lord thought proper, shall we say? Odda saw my potential as a warrior, rather than cleaning pisspots. He turned to Osrith. So yes, Osrith, I can see your point about slavery. But, at least we get to fight, do we not? Be glorious. And that was her brother, then, Osrith thought. She did know some of the pieces, but for them to be put together before her eyes was a shock. And this Utard, what is he like? She asked, thinking about Mildrith and her sadness for her son, their son. Osrith reasoned, her nephew, then. A bastard. Elfrith said. But can fight like no one I've ever seen. Odda trusted him when no one else would, and he fired Guthrum's whole fleet, killed Juba with one move, right in the face, he added. Juba? Ginnavivar, Elfrith added. They all came over, from Denmark, for land. Not to rule, which is why Alfred is on top. Men need governing, and the Danes have no interest in that. He leaned closer to the men. I saw you did the pagan clear a shield wall at Ethan done, he added. He is good. That's why the king tolerates him. And he has land here? Osrith asked. Why the interest? Elfgar asked, suddenly. Just. She screwed up her face. A pagan, she declared, with put-on distaste. How does the king tolerate that? He gives him short enough leash, and keeps him beholden. Elfgar finished. So, while he is a lord in bondage to Alfred, who uses his sword in exchange for tolerating his paganism. He leaned closer to Osrith. If not with such cunning and overlooking of even his own rules, How else will Alfred become Bretwalda? 88,888,888. A boy ran past Osrith as she was put on guard outside the household rooms that afternoon. Usually, the guards were outside the palace, and usually on the ramparts, which Osrith liked, for the views made the duty worthwhile. But, with the increased activity for the betrothal celebrations, the guards had been withdrawn to the inner perimeter of the main palace, the throne room, the kitchens, stables, scriptorium, chapel, to ensure the safety of the guests when they arrived. Uhtred, Osrith thought, and thought over all that Elfgar had told them. So he was here, then, he was there, in Winchester, and held in esteem by the king. But the news, while softening the ache of worry in her stomach in some ways, had begun concerns of a different kind. Uhtred had come, that day, when she had seen him from the high tower at Bibbenberg, with the head of one of Elfric's men, not to reclaim the fortress, though maybe he had, but as the adopted son of a Danish warrior. The picture she had in her mind of her brother, she was slowly being taken apart and rebuilt. If the king valued him. She looked out to the courtyard, hand on buet as a man approached. It was Elfrith. Miral says you are relieved for the night, Elfrith said, as Elfgar strode behind him. Elfgar, he added, as the mercenary man stood beside Osrith, do try to keep your hands off the Lady Elswith, will you? Bloody never will tell you lot anything again, Elfgar replied, grudgingly, taking Osrith's place at the end of the household corridor. Come on, Elfrith called, beckoning Osrith out. She turned towards the stables, but Elfrith took her shoulder. I need a drink, he said, and I think you do too. Nearly killing Steeper today. Do you know how many people have nearly killed Steeper? A lot, I imagine, Osrith replied, relaxing. A weak ale, then, for the next day was bound to be busy, with the mercenaries arriving and the ceremony going ahead. So, Elfrith asked, as they sat near the door, away from the prostitutes. Tell me. What? Osrith asked, as a door banging upstairs indicated another customer. Your story? I'm from Alba, Osrith said, noncommittally. You can't understand me very well because you come from the lands of comfort and good food, and I come from a Dane and Norse ravished land. She sipped at the drink, thinking how much weaker it was compared to the ones Elfbert used to give her. She would be up there now, Osrith supposed, reaping the rewards of more wealth. You speak Saxon, I speak English, Gaelish, Cymric, Norse. And why did you leave? A woman? The king, Osrith said. A difficult matter. With a woman? Elfrith pressed. I've never seen you with a woman. Osrith lowered her tankard, as Elfbert trod slowly down the stairs at the side of the bar, making sure her uncle could see her taking the money from the relieved man. Never seen you, never heard you flirt with one. Never seen you talk to one. Why would I? Osrith said, putting down her tankard. Another group of warriors were entering the inn now, shifting disparate people so they could sit together. A man then. Elfrith lowered his voice. Like Hayard and Godwin. A man. Osrith nodded, looking away. And not all men-loving men treat one another as Hayard and Godwin do. Sometimes, they are betrayed. Were you betrayed? Asked Elfrith. But Osrith shook her head. I left that behind me. I no more want a man, or a woman for that matter, than do I want a rain cloud. Osrith put her tankard back onto the table, then leaned back and folded her arms. Hayard and Godwin are almost inseparable. It's touching, in a sweet way. You're in for a treat then, when the Lord of Mercia arrives. Then Elfrith added, passing his tankard back to the bar. Place will be thronging. Loves women. Loves warriors even more. Everyone will be over him, and I mean everyone. Lord Sjöulf. Behind Elfrith the inn door opened. Through the darkness, Osrit. No, not him. He's so mad he let Alfred mint coins in his name, and the cunning old King Wessex had coins made showing them both. So much for Merson Independendis. Elfrith stopped, and looked where Osrith was looking. You're interested in Lord Uhtred? Elfrith nodded his head in the direction of the group. Osrith started. Uhtred? He's over there. Why the interest? The Lady Mildrith, I suppose. I felt so sorry for her, and obviously, he has battle reputation, Osrith added, trying to sound nonchalant. She was glad it was dark, for she felt her face flush in the dimness of the inn. "Good looking, isn't he?" Elfrith continued. Osrith glared at her comrade. "Look, be careful." "What?" Osrith demanded. "I desire nobody." Elfrith laughed. "The closed heart," he mused. "No, not the Lord Utard, though I would stop staring if I were you if you do not want him to come over. Look, you brought yourself to the attention of the King of Wessex." Osrith glared at him. "In a good way," he conceded, "and he knows you are of Erland. That is unusual in Wessex, and you are fair-headed, which again, unusual." "Look, Elfrith." Osrith slammed down her tankard and pulled him nearer the corner of the inn. "I was married, once, all right. I was in favor to my king, and the Norse attacked. My king's supposed ally betrayed him." Elfrith finished. Osrith nodded. "It happens, of course it happens. And I was ... people like me ... those are the people who pay. So I got out to find my family." She glared over at the raucous drinking from the half-dozen warriors, amongst whom was, by Elfrith's account, her brother. "You think they are here?" Osrith stared at Utard, who was laughing with his men, looked at their faces, at their camaraderie. "Yes, I am certain they are." 88,888,888. Mercia arrived the next day, and if Osrith thought the activity within the palace had been frenetic before, it was nothing to the upheavals that the Queen, that is the Lady of Wessex, Elswith, had implemented. Beds had to be found for her kin, only the best, and the church had to be prepared. Osrith was on guard duty on the ramparts, which she liked, for nothing much happened, and she could think. He had been there, her brother, within spitting distance the night before. Had she not dreamed of it? And yet, all she knew of him ... Osrith knew she could not just turn up in front of him and tell him she was his sister, who knew what he would do. No, the best thing to do, at the moment, was to watch and wait. It was the middle of the morning when, having been relieved by Elfgar, she had made her way to the kitchens, and the sobs of a child could be heard in the family quarters of the palace. Stepping past Hayard, who had been placed on guard by Miral, she saw a boy standing in the passageway, crying. When he saw Osrith he turned away, but did not move, and he was taking great pains to stop. "Is there something I can help you with?" Osrith asked, gently. "Anyone you wish me to kill?" she added, hoping that he might laugh at her silly offer. "No," he conceded, but wouldn't turn round. Osrith wondered who he was. Perhaps he was one of the mercenaries and was lost, or tired, or missing. Yet, when he turned to her, he looked at Osrith, staring at her, with a kind of daring hopefulness in his eyes. He was about 10 or 11, and Osrith thought he reminded her of someone. "You," he began, then stopped, as a girl sauntered past him, looking at the boy mockingly, ignoring Osrith completely. "Stopped snivelling, yet?" she provoked, pushing his shoulder. The boy said nothing, but that he would not look away seemed to enrage her. Osrith looked at her and realized, with some sort of fascinated horror, the girl, young woman, was the very lady who had questioned Osrith about her fight with Steeper the day before, and who this very day was all in aid of Ethelfled. "He is here, Edward." Ethelfled stormed. "Here? With his warriors. He is a hero." "But you can't marry him," the boy insisted. The boy, who now Osrith realized, was the king's firstborn, and the Atheling of Alfred's line. "Besides, he is married already, and you," he added, with what seemed to Osrith an equal amount of provocation as his sister had given to him, "you are going to marry Ethelred of Mercia." Osrith made to step forward as Ethelfled got angry. She made a noise through her teeth and raised her hand to him. But then she stepped back, folding her arms. "Where is your army now, Edward?" she asked, notes of triumph in her lovely voice. She pushed him to the open door of one of the rooms. Osrith followed and saw the princess point to the large fireplace, which was blackened from the previous night's burning. Shock crossed the boy's face, and he continued to stare at the hearth as his sister slipped past Osrith and out into the passageway. Osrith too was horrified. His elder sister had burned his toys. "It doesn't matter," Edward said, when he realized she was still standing beside him. though Osrith could see he was very much upset by it. Ethelfled is to be betrothed and she does not want to be. His big blue eyes turned to Osrith. She teases me sometimes and I can't help crying because she's so mean. Osrith was taken aback for a moment at the boy's honesty, and she dipped to his height. But you will have a real army one day, Osrith said, smiling kindly. Just make sure your sister doesn't burn them in the hearth, eh? Edward looked at her, and frowned a little as he stared at Osrith, and a feeling crept over her that she might like to back away, such was the boy's intensity of gaze. You talk very strangely, he said at length, and seemed to brighten. I will not let Ethelfled burn my armies. My armies will rule over the whole of the 7 kingdoms and hammer the Danes into the earth. And with that, the Etheling of Wessex hurried past her, and down the passageway towards the hall. 88,888,888. Osrith watched nobles and guards come and go that day. Back on the ramparts, which she considered Miral thought to be a punishment, but to her was far from, she watched noble after noble pass through the palace gates like she watched for discrepancies in their manner, which could indicate danger, an invasion, an attack. And finally, after watching, came the Lord Utard. Osrith did not spot him immediately, but his black horse led the procession of 2 others, his warriors in close ranks around him. Who Osrith saw immediately was the woman with him. Beauty shone from her face, not because her features were necessarily beautiful, but because it was clear she loved the warrior who held her closely behind, and she him. Osrith watched them pass by, watching a space just above their heads, which was in line with the wooden buildings towards the east, an easy place for potential enemies, and merely glancing down to them every so often. So, he was a pagan, yet a welcomed warrior, and he inspired loyalty from the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 men who were with him. How should she, Osrith, approach her brother, then? On what basis? You may go down to the celebrations. A voice behind Osrith broke her thoughts and Elfgud grinned. The gates are shut and the feast is to begin, he added. We are all welcome. And Godwin and Hayard are replacing you. 88,888,888. And food she got, as the tables were cleared away from the hall. The boards stretched out in a U-shape where, at the top, sat the king, the Lady Elswith, Ethelfled and young Edward. To his right hand were the Mersons, Ceolwulf to Alfred's side, followed by nobles and servants behind. At the end of the table sat a tall, well-built man, clearly a man, not an older boy like Ethelfled was an older girl, who was chipping into the conversation with the Lord of Mercia and the king. Osrith glanced back to Edward and had to suppress a laugh as she noticed the boy pick his nose then wipe it on Ethelfled's bread. Down one side sat the Wessex nobles, closest of whom was her Lord Odda, then the nobles from Wiltshire and Somersetshire, bordering the lands of Mercia. Kentish nobles sat on the opposite side alongside Utard, who was indeed enjoying the feast. A frown, however, was on the face of one of the Wessex nobles, who was slunk into one corner, a tankard to his lips. He resembled Alfred, and also Edward, but could not place him in the list of nobles to whom she had been introduced. Still staring at the Lord Utard, Alfred asked, leaning past Osrith with a plate of bread and meat. Here, he added, we are to celebrate the union of Wessex and Mercia. I bet Miral and Elfgar are celebrating, she said, sarcastically. So is he, Alfred added, cheerfully. No, really. He thinks he is gaining Wessex, yet he is losing Mercia. The Lord Ethliard, her betrothed. Oh, he doesn't want to, Alfred added. He still believes Mercia is independent, but of course it is not, hacked to pieces by Alfred, a kingdom that is not his own, half given to the Danes. How can he have done that if he did not rule Mercia? So, Utard the Daneslayer. Osrith felt herself blush. I dare say he is not into buggery, Alfred added, biting into a chicken leg. Or boys. I wasn't, Osrith protested, though a voice in her head was telling her how useful this may be. I was wondering, that's all. Wondering, Alfred managed. You, a married man, too, leaving your wife in Alba dead. Osrith snapped back forcefully, heart beating in indignation. Burnt to death in a church trying to rescue innocent people, set fire to by my king's supposed ally. Elfrith stared at her for a few seconds. I'm sorry, he managed. Me and my big mouth. Osrith looked away. But, why is he of interest to you? Osrith swallowed. My king, Flansinner, he hosted exiled princes of Alba. As King Alfred dreams of uniting the Saxon and Angle kingdoms, the kings of Alba have a long-held dream of taking the land in Northumbria, Bernicia, as their own. She leaned closer to Elfrith conspiratorially. But the problem is, Bibbenberg. She looked across to Utad. It is his land, is it not? His uncle rules there, Elfrith confirmed. Yet the Lord Utad desires it. I was to have gone, to fight with the princes, Osrith lied, with that aim. We were told Utad was a savage Dane, and a pagan. He is a pagan, to be sure, Elfrith agreed. Osrith looked across to her brother again. Yet, he does not look like a man in a hurry to return to his homeland, she added, wistfully. Was he comfortable here? Had he given up on that dream? Osrith served the Lord Odda for the rest of that evening and, at length, helped Miral, Elfrith and Elfgar get their inebriated lord into his bed. You go, Miral said to Elfrith and Osrith. I will stay, as will Elfgar. Elfgar, who had promised himself to go out with Elfrith that night to the Two Cranes, and had, Elfrith later told Osrith, an eye on Elfberg, looked crestfallen. Come with me, Osrith, Elfrith asked. Milk for me then, she nodded, as the feasting had changed to drinking and singing, not as raucous as the evenings with the Gales, Osrith thought, as they passed the feasting hall. It was little wonder, for the king, Alfred, had stomach problems which meant he could only bear to eat plain food, and so he and Elswith were sitting together, drinking milk with a little barley, watching the guests enjoy themselves. Who is that? Osrith asked, as they passed by. Ethelwold, Elfrith said, grimly, holding on to his sword. Ethelwold the untrustworthy. Why Alfred keeps him at the palace I will never know. Why? Son of his elder brother, desperate to be king himself. Osrith glanced back at the man, who was slowly surveying the room, while drinking from a flagon of, presumably, ale. His eyes met with the serving maids, who instantly moved out of his way, or turned their heads, and when he moved over to speak to a mercer noble, the whole discourse lasted barely more than 2 minutes. Not trusted, Osrith concluded. But then she turned to Elfrith.